Welcome to the Prime Property Finance Podcast with Gareth Morgan and Mark Watts. This unique podcast will dive deep into all areas of property investing finance, going behind the scenes with property professionals, investors and clients. Between us, we have 35 plus years experience in property finance. The podcast has been launched to share knowledge, mindset requirements and experiences of successful investors and professionals. We aim to simplify many of the complicated areas of finance and investing and provide valuable and easy to implement tips. Keep an eye out for our new longer episodes every Tuesday and our shorter ones every Friday. Welcome to this week's episode of the Prime Property Finance Podcast. This week with myself, Gareth Morgan. This week's episode, we're just going to do a little bit of a dive into what's going on in the market at the moment, a little bit of an economic update in preparation for the budget upcoming next month. So let's dive straight into it. Welcome to the latest episode of the Prime Property Finance Podcast. And in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the market, a bit of an economic update, obviously a little bit pre-budget, and seeing where we see things as the year is starting to come to a close, and a little bit of a forecast for next year and seeing what that looks like for the market, the economy, rates and clients. So let's dive right into it really. I think just trying to understand what's going on in the market. There's a lot going on, in the wider economy and internationally in terms of the politics with America, obviously in Russia and the Ukraine war. Plus, there's obviously the things going on in the Middle East with Israel and Palestine. And whilst we don't want to get dragged into the wider international economy and politics, we have to kind of keep one eye on that. There's also talks, that the S&P 500 is overpriced or overvalued. And that's probably mainly because of the main tech stocks being priced as they are with the increase in AI. However, all of these things, the FTSE 100s, are close to an all-time high. The crypto cycles come into an end, depending on how you look at that. So that's valued quite high as well. So there's lots of things that are valued quite highly. Gold is at an all-time high, which is also an indication that people are moving money out of other investments and into gold as a safe store of wealth. So there's lots going on there, and what we're trying to do is distill that down, and we've taken a lot of advice. We do a bit of reading around what's going on and trying to help you guys understand, our listeners understand as it from property investors in the UK and how that impacts you on your decision making on your investments and what to do. So, just a quick rundown as what we see the market, where the market's at the moment and how we see that panning out into the future. So the first thing is that, in terms of UK GDP, that's kind of bubbling along really flat. The UK is pretty slow. We're not as competitive as we were on the world stage. Obviously, the AI effect on service industry could be interesting. There's a huge number of millionaires leaving the UK due to the changes in the tax regime, which is not good. And those people who are driving economic activity leaving the country and taking their taxable pounds elsewhere is obviously a strain on the economy in itself. So, GDP wise, we're just bubbling along and can't see any major growth spikes on that front. One of the big things that affects mortgages and mortgage rates obviously is inflation, and if inflation is kept under track, then the Bank of England will use obviously the Bank of England base rate as a way to manage inflation. And if inflation comes down over the next 12 months or so, then hopefully interest rates will creep down as well. I don't see it coming down a huge amount from where it is at the moment. Potentially we could be hitting maybe around 3.5% as a Bank of England base rate next year. But that kind of depends on other things that happen in the economy. But hopefully from a mortgage rate perspective, within the buy-to-let space, certainly, we're not getting a huge amount of rates below the sort of 5% mark. Obviously, we are on the residential side, but more on the buy-to-let space. Then we're still hovering around that 5%, a little bit less, depending on how complex it is or not, and if it's in the specialist space, just over that. Hopefully, if the Bank of England interest rate does creep down, then hopefully we'll see rates in the mid fours, or potentially low fours next year. let's watch that space. But the interesting thing really now for me is probably from an investor's perspective is the shift in the supply and demand of rental property. This is really interesting because there's been a huge amount of changes in terms of regulation. You've got the tax changes. We've got an impending budget, which we feel has put a little bit of pressure on the market. I think a lot of investors seem to be holding off a little bit at the moment as to what they plan on doing. The main two things that they're looking from a budget perspective is the potential for national insurance on rental income, which will be very interesting, which is unearned income in the eyes of the government at the moment. But that does only apply to personally held property, which kind of feeds into the narrative we've spoken a lot about on this podcast in the past with various tax advisors, etc., around purchasing property through a limited company. This just adds more fuel to that fire and more reason to do so if that does come in. But we're not going to speculate too much around whether that does come in or not. But that is another reason. And obviously, you've got potentially some other property taxes. We've got some changes in inheritance tax potentially coming in, which could affect those, again, with personally held properties. So I think there's definitely people sitting on their hands a little bit. We had the terrible budget before with Liz Truss, which just made a mess of the economy. So I think people now are expectant more around budget time, just sit on their hands a little bit, especially if they're nervous about some of the changes that might come in because they don't want to snooker themselves. Also, potentially there's some stamp duty changes being mooted. So it's really interesting that the government that's kind of throwing some potential policies and changes out in the market and seeing how things react. So we got another month or so to go before the budget, and we'll do a bit of an update once the budget's in on how that affects the property market or how we see that affecting the property market, to hopefully help you guys have a better understanding. But there's been a huge amount of changes, in terms of the economy. We are very clear that since Labour came in, they said they wanted to build more houses, and what's actually happened is less houses have been built. So whilst on one hand they say that we're going to make it easier to build houses and we're going to sort out the planning system, the reality is that takes a long time to make. They've not been able to implement that as quickly as they like. Development is a slow game, and developers have really sat on their hands a little bit as well because the costs of everything have just gone through the roof. The cost of labour, the shortage of labour, the cost of materials, and they're really struggling to make projects go. I've spoken to a number of developers who have got private sites on the market, and they are not being sold very quickly, and so it's putting a number of developers under pressure. So it's meant a lower supply in stock, a new stock coming onto the market. And with a lot of landlords exiting the market, it means that there's less rental properties on the market to rent. And with natural supply and demand forces, what that's meant is that private rents have gone up. So we're in a position where there's lots of rents going up. There's lots of changes coming in for landlords. And, a lot of people have been coming off of their long-term low fixed rates over the last sort of 5 years. They're coming to the end of those now, where we had those historic low period of rates. And so they're having an increase in interest rates, plus an increase in regulation, plus there's the Renters' Rights Bill coming in. And so there's a lot of talk. Also, we've got the EPC issue, which investors and landlords will have an eye on that. So they'll want to put some money aside for that and bear some costs of that into their forecasting, which is just pushing rents up. And it's easy to push rents up when you're in a low supply environment. So it's really interesting at the moment as to what's actually going on, and just understanding where that leaves you and how you can do it. But ultimately, in the UK at the moment, in Q1 of 2025, the average yield was 7.4%. Which is up year on year, and that's an average yield, so that's a really strong yield. There has been a significant rise in buy-to-let demand. So whilst there are a lot of people leaving the market, people also realise that getting into buy-to-let with their eyes wide open, knowing that the changes are coming, and that there's strong opportunities there, then people are getting into the market as well. So it's not a full case of people are just, the government's putting off landlords. I think what the government are doing is pushing off old landlords, especially ones with properties in their personal name, and then but that's creating some opportunities for younger landlords or newer landlords who are coming in a limited company and are prepared to sort of learn and understand the markets. But there will be pros and cons, and so it's just making sure that you're fully geared up in the right way. But like I said, the rental sector is definitely lacking in terms of supply, which, like we said, is pushing up rents. Borrowing costs, obviously, over the last couple of years have been an increase as well. So there's been an extra pressure on cash flow from landlords. So that's been a big consideration, and hopefully that's started to settle down a little bit now, and it's much clearer. So, we got to just keep looking at what's going on in the market, see where things pan out, and see what the forecast looks like. In terms of rental growth, the forecast suggesting that rents will rise sort of 4.5% to 4% over the next couple of years, which is a strong rental growth. Plus, you've got the capital growth on the properties as well. Again, because of a lack of supply, we know there's a huge immigration issue happening as well, which is forcing hotels to be used as short-term accommodation, emergency accommodation. That's reducing the number of properties to let from for a hotel perspective, which means hotels are getting fuller, and then other people are looking at taking properties off the private rental market and turning them into Airbnbs or holiday lets, and that's reducing the rental market even further, which is just going to push the prices up. So really interesting to see what areas of growth are next year. HMOs, I would imagine, will be a strong area of growth, but ultimately it's about having them in the right condition and having them in the right place, from a location perspective. So also, that just talked about the budget, potential changes for national insurance and other taxes and surcharges. So I think we just got to sit tight and not second guess too much about what's happening there. But ultimately, there are really strong areas in the UK in regards to the buy-to-let market. There are some really strong yields outside of London, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I guess whilst the market at the moment is, there seems to be a lot of fear in the news and in the marketplace. All you hear in the news, not that I watch the news, but all you hear is about how difficult how things aren't working, the changes, the taxes. And so it puts a lot of people off, and we see people sitting on their hands. So for those active investors who understand the game, the rules of the game and how it works and the economy, there are definitely opportunities out there. So anyone who's, probably going to come in, there's opportunities for stronger cash flow and capital growth because of the lack of supply and the lack of competition. People who plan ahead can get, make sure they got good long-term finance deals, making sure they got quality tenants, quality locations. And, another huge area of growth is going to be around the housing association, supported living, long-term leases, where you can really, really increase your margins and reduce your headache in that space. So we probably see that as a big area of growth this year. And then things, from a risk perspective, things to consider. Obviously, the budget, we never know what's going to happen, but there will be more taxes on landlords because they're an easy target, and that will affect yields and cash flow. Borrowing costs have come down in most areas, but they're still higher than what they have been in the past. So that is affecting cash flow. So that's something, hopefully, if the rates come down next year, then that'll squeeze, a bit more cash flow out for landlords. And like I said earlier, some regulatory changes, the EPC changes, the landlord obligations, and the Renters' Rights Bill, that really coming in. So, they're trying to manage those costs and manage your margins at the same time. So you really do need to give some consideration to the types of property to buy in, the location, where there's going to be strong capital growth and strong rent growth in prime areas, really. And so what's the best thing to do? What do you need to consider? Then really stress testing the worst case scenario. Too many times we see investors stress test things on ideal conditions. And I think with such an amount of volatility around at the moment, and just making sure that when you are looking to purchase a property, that you stress test in the worst case scenario, looking at higher interest rates, what happens if you do have void periods, what happens if you have additional costs, for the EPCs and additional regulatory costs that come in. Then, assume the worst effectively. And if it still works, then it could still be a good long-term investment. And I've talked about this a number of times in the past, is making sure it matches your criteria, really understanding what your metrics are, because your metrics are for you, and what might be a good deal for you might not be a great deal for the next person. So knowing your metrics and sticking to them, and having a checklist to work through every time you're assessing a deal. And then, just making sure that you're not using up all of your cash, keeping a buffer for costs and upgrades. And just staying agile and staying informed. There are lots of changes always. We'll try and share those changes with you. We'll bring on guests to bring on their expertise in their areas. But ultimately, it's about staying informed, speaking to other investors, seeing what they are doing, seeing what's working in different locations. There are so many different challenges around the country, with different strategies working in some locations and other strategies working in other locations. So you do really need to be hyper-focused on the area that you're in, and just try and speak to as many people as you can, and try and get as much information and content as you can from those other people. So with that being said, that comes to the end of just a quick economic update. Watch this space as to what's going to happen with the budget. We look forward to hearing that. We probably won't look forward to reading the details so much, but hopefully it's not as bad as it's been made out to be. But whatever there is, there's opportunity for those who are informed and ready to move. So get yourself prepared, get ready, and try and get out there and do some deals while everybody else is sitting on their hands. Thanks for listening. See you soon. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Prime Property Finance Podcast. We really appreciate you listening to the end. We really appreciate you listening. We really value your feedback that we're getting from you guys, and continuing to listen to it, which makes it all worthwhile for us. If you enjoyed this episode and you took any value from it, or there was any nuggets in there that you took, then we'd really appreciate if you could share it with any friends or family, or other investors that you might meet whilst you're out networking, as I mentioned. And if you can like and subscribe, that'd be a really great thing for us, and we really appreciate your support. Thanks again, and speak soon. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope you have learned something and have some tips to take away. We'd be very grateful if you enjoyed the show. You could give us a review and share with anyone that you know that may be interested. And of course, subscribe to the show so you can get notified when a new episode is released. If you'd like us to answer any questions or go deeper on a specific topic, please drop us a message at primeproperty.finance. See you on the next episode.